Hey guys, Caleb here from CDBS Studios, and welcome back to the series where I am going through the entire MCU timeline. In the last video, we talked about the flashbacks and the origins of the MCU, going from the start of the universe all the way up to the end of the year 2007. So if you want to see that video, if you want to get caught up to speed of where we are currently in the timeline, go watch that video. And if you want to see the general just project information when it comes to this timeline, go watch my part 0. Both of them will be on my channel. But for now, let's jump in let's start right where we left off as we venture into part 2, the Infinity Saga. Picking up right where we left off with is starting in the year 2008, where we meet up with Natasha, where we reconnect with Natasha Romanoff, who during a mission in where during all of her missions for the Red Room, she eventually ends up on Shield's radar, and Shield ends up deploying Clint Barton, aka Hawkeye, to go after her. However, when Hawkeye meets up with Natasha, he can sense that she does not want to be part of the Red Room anymore, so the two of them work together to track down the leader of the Red Room, Dreykov, where they end up actually following Dreykov's daughter in Budapest to Dreykov's supposed location, in which they end up bombing the building in order to take out Dreykov, but also are forced to take out Dreykov's daughter, something Natasha deeply regrets for many years to come. We reconnect with Iron Man here, where Iron Man ends up showing off his latest invention, the Jericho missile. However, when he uses it in Afghanistan, he is later then captured by the 10 Rings and brought to a cave where he is locked away and forced to make a replica of the Jericho missile for the 10 Rings. We quickly head over back to New York, where we find out that after one day at school, Maya Lopez ends up going to an ice cream cart to try to buy some ice cream, but the man can't understand her sign language. Becoming increasingly frustrated at the sight he's witnessing, Maya's Kingpin ends up stepping into the thing to actually beat up the man and get Maya the ice cream she wants. This leads us into the main events of Iron Man, in which after many months in the cave, Tony Stark finally is able to use his intellect to make the first Iron Man suit, which he uses to escape the cave and return back to civilization. After realizing he can do more with his life, he decides to shut down the weapons manufacturing at his company and fully devote his time to the Iron Man suit. However, he eventually uses the Iron Man suit to stop the operations over in Afghanistan before learning that one of his business partners, Obadiah Stane, actually originally kidnapped Tony Stark to get rid of him and has taken his Mark I suit to use as his new suit, the Ironmonger. Tony and Obadiah end up fighting each other before Obadiah actually ends up dying. Originally, S.H.I.E.L.D. tries to cover up the whole event by trying to make it off that Tony Stark was somewhere else, but Tony goes against their wishes to say to the entire world that he is Iron Man. Shortly after, though, a man named Ivan Vanko actually experiences this broadcast shortly after his father dies. His father, Anton Vanko, was actually worked with Howard Stark and was the original creator of the arc reactor. Ivan creates so much stone for Tony Stark that Ivan creates a plan to build his own arc reactor with Anton's blueprints so that he can go after Tony Stark. This leads us into 2009, where during their time at college, Foggy Nelson and Matt Murdock have become very close friends, and the two of them make a promise to one another that no matter what happens to them, they will become business partners as lawyers. Also in 2009, still trapped down in the quantum realm, Janet has learned to live with her life until a man ends up crashing down in the quantum realm with her. His name is Kang. He ends up showing her his ship that can actually work as a time machine, and working together, they are eventually able to fix up the machine. But when Janet fixes the machine, she ends up trapped. She ends up going into Kang's mind for a minute, learning that he is a timeline-destroying conqueror. She decides to destroy the core that ends up powering Kang's ship before fleeing. However, due to Kang now having his power suit back, Kang now enslaves the quantum realm and turns it into his own personal kingdom. Jumping forward to 2010, the High Evolutionary has still had so much trouble trying to perfect his ultimate beings of life, and he cannot get batch 9. He cannot get any batches right. However, he finds out that Rocket's brain is far beyond anything he's ever discovered in the past, and Rocket is eventually able to figure out the secret to figuring out the High Evolutionary's problem in creating the perfect form of his life. However, he soon realizes that High Evolutionary plans to kill all of them now that he has created the perfect form of life. Rocket tries to escape that night, but the High Evolutionary kicks onto his plan and ends up killing Lila, Teefs, and Floor. Rocket, in a fit of rage, ends up scratching up the High Evolutionary a lot before he ends up escaping the High Evolutionary. Similar, going back down to Earth, we end up meeting up with Bruce Banner, who's been in hiding for all these years and ends up working at a factory for Pico Dolce Soda. However, during the workday, he ends up actually getting some of his gamma radiated blood in one of the soda bottles that actually ends up getting into the soda that Stan Lee later drinks. This leads us into our next event, where we have our first case of overlapping events, where we first end up at the start of Iron Man 2, where Tony Stark officially restarts the Stark Expo, before end up heading off to Washington, D.C. for a hearing where the United States Armed Forces tried to take his Iron Man suit, but he ends up outing Justin Hammer's actions, where he tries to replicate the Stark suit before he ends up saying he privatized world peace before leaving. Similarly, across the world, the U.S. military actually tries to ambush Bruce in Guatemala before Bruce is able to escape. This actually brings us to one of our biggest overlapping events that we're going to have in the MCU, Fury's Big Week, in which multiple events happen at the exact same time together, so I'm just going to go through each one pretty simply. First, we have the rest of the events of Iron Man 2, where Tony Stark ends up realizing that he is slowly dying due to his arc reactor due to the palladium poisoning in his body. He also is attacked by Whiplash, Ivan Vanko finally coming for his revenge, before Ivan fakes his death and is hired by Justin Hammer to create a bunch of drones. Tony ends up going too far with his reckless nature, and Rhodey ends up stealing his Mark II suit to give to the government themselves. This eventually leads to him being his suit being tampered with by Justin Hammer, turning it into the War Machine. Tony then gets in contact with S.H.I.E.L.D., who ends up towing him to Natasha Romanoff, and together, Tony is able to figure out the palladium poisoning problem due to videos from his father, and he creates a new arc reactor and a new Iron Man suit. Tony then teams up with both Natasha Romanoff and War Machine at the Stark Expo to take out all of Ivan's drones, Ivan himself, and also Justin Hammer goes to prison. However, during the midpoint of Iron Man 2, Coulson was actually taken away from Tony Stark's mission to go to a mission in New Mexico. During his mission, he ends up actually stopping in a gas station to stop it from a robbery. This leads us into the events of Thor, where up in the mystical realm of Asgard, the Thor Odinson is about to be crowned the king of Asgard before the Frost Giants interrupt his coronation. Thor, so angry at them, decides to go down to their homeworld of Jotunheim to attack them, discovering it's actually a trap. He is bailed out by Odin before Odin calls Thor out on his arrogant nature, and so strips away his powers and banishes him to Earth. Not before he puts a spell on his hammer Mjolnir, saying that anybody can only wield it if they're worthy of it. While Thor is stranded on Earth, he ends up coming into contact with a couple scientists, Jane Foster, Eric Selvig, and Darcy Lewis, who end up teaching Thor some humility. While up in Asgard, Loki ends up taking over the throne of Asgard, and after Thor's friends learn about that Loki actually orchestrated the Frost Giants invasion, Thor ends up officially sacrificing himself for his friends and proving himself worthy, which allows him to return to Asgard and beat Loki. Loki, however, decides not to go to a prison and falls into a black hole and is presumed dead. However, back on Earth, Nick Fury has taken notice to Eric Selvig's involvement in the Thor stuff and has so hired him to be part of Project Insight. This finally brings us into the Incredible Hulk, where after running from the government, Bruce Banner continues to try to find a way to reverse the Hulk, but he is eventually unable to do it. This eventually leads to General Ross, who has been hunting Bruce for the whole movie, giving the version of the serum that Bruce had to another man named Emil Blonsky, who actually turns into a monster named Abomination. Hulk is forced to fight Abomination, and he eventually is able to get Abomination locked back up in prison before Bruce ends up going back on the run. This then brings us to the events of the Consultant, where the Avengers Initiative is still trying to get started up, and Fury is still looking for his different members. While the U.S. government wants Emil Blonsky's Abomination to be part of the Avengers Initiative, Fury strongly advises against it. This leads to to Shield agents Jasper Sitwell and Phil Coulson trying to find a way, trying to pick a consultant who can go talk to Agent Ross, but they want this consultant to try to keep Emil Blonsky behind bars. They eventually pick Tony Stark, which leads into the post-credit scene of Incredible Hulk, where Tony Stark shows up at a bar to talk to Ross to try to talk about the Avengers Initiative. However, Ross ends up being so angry at Tony that the Emil Blonsky isn't permanently left behind bars, not to be part of the Avengers Initiative. This jumps us forward to 2011, where the Valkyrie plane is finally discovered in the ice, and Steve Rogers is dug out. He is then defrosted, and originally S.H.I.E.L.D. wants to ease him into the fact that he's been asleep for 7 years, but Steve ends up breaking out and entering modern-day New York City, where he is approached by Nick Fury, who recruits him to the Avengers Initiative, which also we have another event happening in New York at the same time, where military friends Billy Russo and Frank Castle end up playing a game called Down the Line with their friends in the military. Also in 2011, we end up meeting a woman named Mary Walker, who also has DID, who is locked in a Sokovian prison. However, she ends up blacking out and ends up outside of the prison. Due to the events of her DID, the personality of Mary just believes Walker did it, while Walker believes there is something else going on entirely. This finally brings us to 2012 with the events of the Avengers, where after Project Insight has gone off the rails, Loki becomes aware of the Tesseract and comes to Earth with his scepter to try to take the Tesseract for an unknown master. This causes Nick Fury to assemble the Avengers for the first time, and after much bickering and a lot of fighting, the Avengers eventually form together during the Battle of New York, where Loki uses the Tesseract to bring the Chitauri army to Earth to eventually fight all together and officially become the Avengers. Afterwards, the Avengers all go their separate ways, with Loki being taken back to Asgard by Thor and the Tesseract, along with the Tesseract, while the Avengers go their separate ways, knowing that they will eventually be brought back together if the Earth demands it. While secretly the scepter of Loki is actually stolen by Hydra, who is using secret agents inside of S.H.I.E.L.D., and also that we learn that Thanos is the one that sent Loki, hoping that he would collect another Infinity Stone. In reality, Thanos is now just one stone less than when he started. Of course, we actually have a couple of events that overlap with the events of the Avengers, the first of which is the Captain America the First Avenger post-credit scene, which is just the scene from the Avengers where Nick Fury recruits Steve Rogers. But an event that is also part of it is that during the events of the Battle of New York, a young Kate Bishop, is actually saved by Clint Barton, Hawkeye, and so after the battle, Kate Bishop vows that she wants to be exactly like him, and so decides to start practicing archery. This leads to after the events of the movie, where a cleanup crew is run by Adrian Toomes trying to clean up all the Chitauri damage around the city. However, they are screwed over for their efforts when Tony Stark founds the Department of Damage Control to take care of it. However, Adrian Toomes learned that some of his guys still have some of the Chitauri tech, and so they decide to sell it on the black market as weapons. Similarly, after arriving back on Asgard, Loki is given a trial by Odin, where he is sentenced to the Asgard dungeons. Shortly after the events of the Battle of New York, Nick Fury also arrives in Paris, where he meets up with his wife Vara, as the two of them read poetry together. Similarly, while the S.H.I.E.L.D. is still trying to collect all of the leftover Chitauri technology, one of their Chitauri blasters ends up outside of their hands, and it ends up acquired by a couple who use it to rob multiple places around the country. Eventually, Jasper Sitwell is able to hunt them down, and instead of putting them in prison, he actually hires them as agents. Then sometime around this time is when Captain America, Steve Rogers, would have filmed the videos that are later showed at Peter Parker's school, like the Captain America Fitness Challenge, and also the one that serves as the Spider-Man Homecoming post-credit scene, which is about Captain America talking about patience. This officially jumps us into 2013, where we come to Carl Lucas's first day in prison, where after committing a crime, he is sentenced to prison and he spends his first day there. Shortly afterwards, best friends Frank Castle and Billy Russo end up watching a game of baseball while they end up talking about their traumatic pasts. Shortly afterwards, we jump to Carl Lucas as he's spending his time in prison. He is eventually visited by his parents, which is actually the last time Carl Lucas will ever see his mother, as she dies shortly after this visit. Shortly after, we also have Frank Castle takes his kids on a trip on the Staten Island ferry, where he talks about the fact that he is being drafted to a war over in Kandahar, that he's going over with Billy Russo, and he tells his kids that he will be safe. This jump, we quickly meet back up with Jessica Jones, who ends up having an argument with Trish Walker about being a superhero. But when Jessica is challenged to a bet in a bar, she uses her super strength to absolutely win the bet. No problem. We end up coming back to Frank Castle, who has been deployed to Kandahar by this point, and ends up working on this mission with Billy Russo and his boss Albert Rackham, aka Agent Orange. This also, cutting back over to Carl Lucas. Carl Lucas, after getting in a fight, ends up spending the night in solitary confinement. This also comes to Jessica Jones during one of her nights walking around the town. She ends up meeting a man named Kilgrave, who has a mysterious power that allows him to hypnotize anybody by just saying a command. Jessica ends up accidentally hypnotized by Kilgrave as Kilgrave falls in love with her. And Jessica ends up just accidentally as Kilgrave's puppet. Cutting back over to Carl Lucas, we learn that he has eventually been spending a lot of time in solitary, but then he is approached by Rackham, who is a warden at the prison, who actually wants to hire Lucas for this underground boxing match that he has going. Carl Lucas actually declines the offer here. Rackham is not very happy about that. We end up then cutting back a couple times to Jessica Jones and spending her time with Kilgrave, where she eventually ends up spending her 1-month anniversary with him. And at one point, Jessica's mind control ends up wearing off, and she considers jumping off a balcony to escape Kilgrave, but Kilgrave regains control before she can. Jumping back over to Carl Lucas, during his time in prison, he actually ends up making friends with a man named Squabbles in the prison. Then we finally reach the events of Thor: The Dark World, where the next convergence is set to occur, the event where all of the 9 realms are in alignment. But at the same time, due to this alignment, there's weird portals being opened up where people and objects are able to cut between the realms, and Jane Foster actually ends up infected with the mysterious Aether. Malekith, the dark elf, wakes up from hibernation and tries to reach Jane, while the Asgardians try to protect her. Thor eventually, during an invasion of Asgard that actually happens, and eventually during an invasion of Asgard, the Dark Elves actually kill Thor's mother Frigga, and they hold a funeral for her. This eventually becomes leverage that encourages Loki to work with Thor and Jane, where they plan to take Jane to the Dark Elves' homeworld, where the Dark Elves will extract the Aether from Jane, but Thor will destroy it before they can. However, the plan goes terribly wrong as Malekith gets control of the Aether and Loki actually dies. This causes Thor and Jane to return to Earth, where they end up in a final battle with Malekith, where they eventually are able to take control of the convergence portals, and they end up killing Malekith with his own ship. The Asgardians then take the Aether and actually give it to a man named Talir Tavon the Collector, revealing that the Aether is actually one of the 6 Infinity Stones. And when Thor is actually offered the chance to become the King of Asgard, Thor turns it down to go back to Earth to be with Jane. But it's revealed that Loki actually survived his battle with the Dark Elves, and now is actually posing as Odin, now being the King of Asgard. This then jumps us back to Carl Lucas, where Carl Lucas ends up having an interview with Reva Connors, a girl that Carl Lucas is starting to become a little bit infatuated with. This then eventually jumps us to, after lots of pleading and eventually some blackmail with squabbles, Carl eventually agrees to be part of the underground fight ring, which leads to his first fight. Then that leads us into the events of Iron Man 3, which during this Christmas, Tony Stark ends up having a bunch of PTSD from the events of the Battle of New York, and so has built a ton of different suits, eventually bringing up to his Mark 42 armor. But eventually, Tony in this movie ends up getting traumatized by a man named the Mandarin, who is eventually the leader of the 10 rings, and is holding the nation hostage as this terrorist. However, after much time trying to track him down, Tony eventually learns that he is a fake He is just an actor named Trevor Slattery who was hired by Aldrich Killian, who is the real Mandarin. But not the leader of the Ten Rings. Tony ends up in a final battle against Aldrich after he kidnaps Pepper, but it ends up culminating in Tony blowing up all his Iron Man suits, and he ends up going through surgery to get the arc reactor and the shrapnel removed from his chest, fully removing him of the arc reactor. This then jumps us into 2014, which after Carl Lucas ends up in a bad injury during his underground fighting, he is broken out of the prison to be experimented on, but this experiment goes a little bit wrong and gives Carl Lucas indestructible skin. He later escapes the prison and is taken in by Reva Connors. Carl Lucas, realizing he can't go by that name anymore as he's supposed to be dead, ends up changing his name to Luke Cage. This then jumps us to the post-credit scene of Iron Man 3 where Tony it reveals that the whole narration of Iron Man 3 was Tony doing therapy with Bruce Banner continuously falling asleep, which he also keeps telling Tony he's not a therapist, but Tony doesn't listen. This brings us to eventually Luke Cage and Reva Connors end up getting married together. This also cuts us into the events that we start to see some of the montage of Thor and Jane's life on Earth, the first event of which happens here, where Thor makes pancakes with Jane. Then we end up in events where where Kilgrave ends up finding that Reva Connors is hiding the secret experimentation that was also done to him. So he ends up hypnotizing Reva Connors to lead them to the place where it's hidden, while Jessica ends up breaking it out. However, after the event happens, Kilgrave has Jessica kill Reva Connors. However, something happens during this event where Jessica is able to finally snap free of the mind control, and Kilgrave finds he can no longer control her. While he is in a desperate attempt to try to regain control of Jessica Jones, Kilgrave is actually hit by a bus and presumed dead. This leads us into the final events of where we lead into the final events of the montage of Shang-Chi and Legend of the Ten Rings, where Shang-Chi enters the late stages of his training. Then we end up in a sad flashback where we see Luke Cage standing over Reva Connors' grave after her death at the hands of Jessica Jones. Then we end up in the events of All Hail the King, where during his time in prison, Trevor Slattery has been interviewed by this man as he tries to get a sense of who Trevor Slattery is for a little documentary. However, it's eventually revealed that the man that's interviewing him actually works for the Ten Rings, and the real Mandarin wants his name back. Then we jump into the events of Captain America: The Winter Soldier, where Steve Rogers finally learns that S.H.I.E.L.D. has been overtaken by Hydra as it's grown inside of S.H.I.E.L.D. like a tumor for centuries. Steve Rogers eventually teams up with not only Black Widow, but also Nick Fury and newcomer to the team, Sam Wilson's The Falcon, to take on S.H.I.E.L.D. and try to stop them from launching Project Insight, which is a project where where Hydra will release 3 helicarriers into the sky with an algorithm developed by Arnim Zola. The algorithm can predict who will be a threat to Hydra, and so the helicarrier will target all of the people on this list and start taking them out one by one. They also come into contact with the Winter Soldier, with Steve finally learning what they have done to Bucky Barnes. They end up in a final battle where Project Insight is destroyed. However, Steve is also able to break through to Bucky and break him free of his Winter Soldier programming. However, Bucky decides to leave Steve and go on his own mission, with Steve and Sam leaving to track him down. This brings us into the events where over in Sokovia, the Maximoff twins, still having that scorn for Tony Stark, agree to Hydra's experimentation that they've been doing, where they're trying to use Loki's scepter to try to enhance individuals. Eventually, they are able to get it to work on both Pietro and Wanda, but during Wanda's experiment, she ends up having a vision of the future where she is the Scarlet Witch. This leads us into the post-credit scenes of the Winter Soldier, where we end up seeing that the experimentation on both Wanda and Pietro worked, and Hydra's monitoring them, while also Bucky decides to go to the Smithsonian exhibit on Captain America to try to learn a little bit more about who he was. This brings us to our next Jane and Thor flashback, where while they're playing around together, Jane ends up punching Thor with this big yellow puffy boxing glove. Then this jumps into our first cutting back over to Frank Castle, who during his mission in Kandahar actually participates in an event where they end up tying up Ahmad Ahmad Zubair, who has apparently information that that Agent Orange wants. However, he is also assassinated in this event. However, someone actually films this event, which we'll catch up with later. This then brings us to the events where the end of Shang-Chi's training, where Wenwu has actually found the man who killed Shang-Chi's mother and so deploys Shang-Chi to get his revenge. Shang-Chi goes through with his revenge but ends up feeling terrible about it, so he ends up running away from his father and changing his name to Sean so he can hide in the United States. Then we end up in our next Jane and Thor flashback, where Jane and Thor end up roller skating together as they're pulled by Mjolnir. Then we jump into another event while Misty Knight and Raphael Scarf are investigating a criminal known as Hamilton. Hamilton is actually taken to prison after finding a gun that we later learn was actually planted by Raphael Scarf. Then we jump to another Thor and Jane flashback where Thor plays Kendama with Jane. Then we jump to we finally catch up with Matt Murdock, where Matt Murdock and Foggy Nelson have started to have gotten an internship at a local law firm, but they decide they want more, so they decide to leave this firm to start their own one. While at the same time, Matt becomes increasingly more angry that the fact that every night when he tries to go to sleep, he constantly keeps hearing screams around Hell's Kitchen. So he finally decides to adopt the persona as the Devil of Hell's Kitchen to fight crime. Then this brings us into the main events of the Guardians of the Galaxy, where after years of being tortured and that by the Ravengers, Peter Quill eventually decides to screw them over by stealing an orb that he finds that he tries to sell before learning it actually holds one of the 6 Infinity Stones, the Power Stone. Look, he ends up teaming up with the daughter of Thanos, Gamora, who also wants to get away from Gamora. Two bounty hunters named Rocket and Groot, and also a man named Drax the Destroyer, whose family was actually killed by Thanos. Together, they end up working together to stop a man named Ronan the Accuser, who wants to use the Power Stone to destroy the planet of Xandar. They end up working together to defeat Ronan, and they end up officially becoming the Guardians of the Galaxy. The Power Stone is then hidden on Xandar to keep it safe, while the Guardians fly off into the sunset. However, unfortunately, during that final battle, Groot ends up dying before he is reborn due to Rocket planting some of Groot's discarded twigs. This leads us quickly, before we do anything else with the Guardians, we check back up with Thor, where Thor and Jane watch a horror movie where Thor protects himself with Mjolnir. Then we jump back to the Guardians, where we end up seeing the first events where Groot, after slightly regrowing at the end of Guardians, he now officially grows into a little baby version of himself as he breaks out of the pot that Rocket planted him in. This leads us into the main events of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, where after many months spent together, the Guardians end up meeting Ego, Peter's father, while Peter, Drax, and Gamora are on Ego's planet trying to learn more about him. Rocket, Groot, and Yondu team up to take out the Ravengers before eventually arriving on Ego's planet to try to save Peter Quill. Eventually, this all culminates in Ego dying and Yondu actually sacrificing himself to save Peter, when Peter realizes that Yondu was his father the whole time. A Ravager funeral is then held for Yondu, as the Guardians end up forming once and for all with their new members, Mantis and Nebula. This leads us into the second episode of I Am Groot, where Groot ends up discovering a little civilization that after he uncovers them, they evolve at a massive rate and ends up in a fight with Groot before Groot accidentally steps on them. Then we jump into after a Halloween party that Thor goes to with Jane. Thor makes Mjolnir a promise to always look after Jane, unknowingly giving it a new enchantment. This leads us into episode 3 and 4 of I Am Groot, where we end up having Groot chase a creature on the Guardian's ship that can actually make itself look like anything, and he ends up in a dance-off with a creature that looks like himself. And then also Groot decides to take a bath in mysterious water that keeps making Groot grow random tree-like outfits. Then we jump back to Frank Castle in Kandahar, where his team is actually ambushed, and Frank, being so angry at this ambush, decides to abandon the mission to go back to the United States after a huge blow-up at Agent Orange. Then we jump to the final episode of the first season of I Am Groot, where Groot ends up using a bunch of random things on the Guardian ship to make a fun little drawing of the Guardians as a family, which Rocket really enjoys. Then we have the entire second season of I Am Groot, where Groot basically does a bunch of random or high drinks, like he ends up stopping on a snow day to fight a snow golem. He goes to a space ice cream truck, and he ends up having a run-in with the Watcher, with Uatu, the Watcher himself. Then we jump to an event where while Thor and Jane are walking together down a street, Thor ends up seeing a baby in a window and ends up a little concerned of what his future will be like with Jane. This finally brings us into 2015, where we come to the first of the events of the first season of Daredevil, where Matt Murdock, still parading as the devil of Hell's Kitchen, ends up trying to take down the criminal organization of Wilson Fisk. Eventually, Matt ends up in a final battle with Wilson Fisk using a new suit designed by Wilson Fisk's own tailor, Melvin Potter, and Matt ends up after sending Wilson Fisk to jail. Matt ends up as officially Daredevil. On his civilian side, he ends up working with Foggy Nelson at their new law firm, Nelson and Murdoch. Also, eventually roping in Karen Page, who was one of their first clients, later becomes their receptionist. Foggy actually later learns Matt's identity as Daredevil, but agrees to keep it from Karen. And the three of them end up going on together as Nelson and Murdoch. Then we end up following Wilson Fisk to his first day in prison, where we find out that even though he might be in prison, he still runs New York City as the crime boss. Then we head over back to Kunlun, where we end up seeing that where Davos and Danny Rand have both earned the right to challenge each other for the right to be Iron Fist. The two of them end up in a battle that ends up all night, with Danny eventually proving victorious, giving him the right to challenge the Dragon Shallow for the right to be Iron Fist. Then we jump into the first episodes of Jessica Jones, where after many years of trying to pick herself up after being controlled, Jessica learns that Kilgrave is actually still alive, and so goes on a mission to try to track down Kilgrave and take him down. This eventually leads us into we cut back to Danny Rand, where Danny Rand ends up in his trial with Shallow, where he eventually does defeat him and eventually becomes the new Iron Fist. Shortly after the trial, he is actually discovered by Davos, who brings him back to Kunlun. This brings us to episode 5 of Jessica Jones, where Jessica Jones is still working to track down Kilgrave during this episode. This then brings us to the Castle Family Massacre, where Wall Agent Orange and Billy Russo are still over back in Kandahar. They learn that someone actually taped the assassination of Ahmed Zubair, and they want to figure out who. They believe that it's Frank Castle. Dude was blow up at them, so they orchestrate a tragedy where 3 different crime groups will be in Central Park at the carousel the Castle family likes to go to at the same time, so that Billy Russo and his team can actually go in and kill the Castle family, and it'll just be seen as a massacre against 3 gangs. Frank, however, doesn't know about Billy Russo and solely thinks it's the gangs to blame for his family's death. This leads us to the back half of Jessica Jones, where Jessica Jones eventually is finally able to meet back up with Kilgrave, and she is eventually able to kill him. Also throughout this season, Jessica Jones formed a little bit of a relationship with Luke Cage. However, she broke it off with him after learning Reva Connors was his wife, and the two of them ended going the separate ways, with Jessica also coming back to Alias Investigation, or investigation company, running it with the help of her new friend, Malcolm, who she saved during the course of the season. This brings us into the events of Age of Ultron, where the Avengers have been trying to track down the Loki scepter and eventually do find it. However, Tony and Bruce end up playing with things they can't control and end up actually bringing to life Ultron, a dangerous program that tries to end humanity. That also recruits the Maximoff twins. Eventually, the Maximoff twins realize Ultron's plan to kill all of humanity, so switch sides. While at the same time, the Avengers also steal Ultron's secondary body and use it to upload Jarvis into it to create Vision. All of them end up working together to fight Ultron at his home at Sokovia, which he turns into a meteor. But they end up destroying Sokovia and turning it into a barren wasteland. While at the same time, unfortunately, Hulk ends up lost because he ends up on a disguised Quinjet. The Avengers have no idea where it went. This leads us into a flashback we see where while Thor and Jane are hanging out, Thor is forced to leave after getting a call from Fury, perhaps without telling Jane what's going on. This leads us into the ending of Avengers Age of Ultron, where after Avengers Tower kind of becomes a little bit too of a hotspot, the Avengers move to an upstate facility, which is an old Stark warehouse. That becomes the new Avengers facility. During this event, Thor decides to leave Earth after realizing that 4 of the 6 Infinity Stones have already shown themselves in the last couple years that something big is going on. So goes ahead to go look for them. Tony decides to leave the team to kind of live a little more simple life, while Steve Rogers and Natasha Romanoff end up recruiting the next era of the Avengers, being Vision, Wanda, Rhodey, and Sam Wilson. This brings us into the events of while they're just hanging out at the compound, Wanda Maximoff and Vision end up bonding with one another, while Wanda ends up showing Vision the magic of sitcoms, where Vision ends up dropping the magical line from WandaVision of "What is grief if not love persevering." This brings us into the main events of Ant-Man, where after about 5 years in prison, I think it is. Yeah, it is. Where Scott Lang is released from prison and tries to take a back of his life with his daughter, but it proves to be more difficult than he imagined. He is eventually hired by Hank Pym and Hope Van Dyne to become the next heir of Ant-Man, to steal a dangerous replica of the suit known as the Yellow Jacket from Hank's old protege, Darren Cross. Eventually, they do the heist, but the heist goes wrong, and Scott ends up in a fight with Darren before Scott ends up actually turning off his regulator to go subatomic to stop Darren, causing both of them to crash into the quantum realm. However, Scott is able to get out, and returns to the normal world, which ends up taking the minds of Hank, thinking that there is a way to actually go down to the quantum realm and find Janet. This brings us into the first event of Doctor Strange, where an old master of Kamar-Taj known as Caecilius ends up stealing some rituals from the Book of Cagliostro, but he is pursued by the Ancient One, who ends up using the mirror dimension and some of the powers from the book that Caecilius stole to actually stop him. However, Caecilius and a couple of his followers do actually get away. This leads us into the first event of This leads us into another flashback from Daredevil season 2, where while Fisk is still in prison, he still runs the prison and is still trying to make sure that Vanessa stays safe outside of the United States, and he still makes sure to run the entirety of New York City. Then we finally brings us into the events of Daredevil season 2, where we have our first couple of episodes where while Matt is still parading as Daredevil, Frank Castle actually arrives in Hell's Kitchen to enact his revenge against the three gangs that were responsible for his family's death, and he ends up in crossfires with Daredevil, while the two of them end up in a fight against each other on which one's ways of fighting crime is more right. Then we end up seeing Micro's death, where we actually learn that Matt Leiperman, or Micro, is actually the one who has the tape of the assassination of Ahmed Zubair. However, when Billy Russo learns of this, he actually kills Micro, but however, the bullet actually hit Micro's phone, so he is alive. However, Micro decides to go into hiding so that his family can stay out of harm's way. This then leads us also into a flashback we see from Ironheart, where a young Riri Williams actually dances with Gary, her stepdad, while they're at their garage together. This then leads us into our first real overlapping point of the Netflix era, where we have the overlapping events of Daredevil season 2 and Luke Cage season 1, where we have Daredevil season 2 episodes 4 through 7, Luke Cage episode 1, Daredevil episode 8, Luke Cage episode 2, Daredevil episode 9, Luke Cage episode 3 and 4, Daredevil episodes 10 and 11, Luke Cage episode 5, Daredevil episodes 12 and 13, and Luke Cage episodes 6 to 13. During Daredevil season 2, not only is Frank Castle is eventually brought to justice, and Matt Murdock eventually decides to be his lawyer to try to get him out of trouble, while also at the same time on his Daredevil side, Elektra comes back into Matt's life, and the two of them end up tracking down a dangerous organization known as the Hand, trying to stop them from getting a mysterious weapon known as the Black Sky. However, Matt eventually realizes the Black Sky is Elektra, so he tries to protect her while also trying to take care of Frank, and both lives end up strained when eventually Frank is actually sentenced to prison, but Frank ends up getting out thanks to help from the Kingpin, and Frank ends up tracking down his old General Schoonover, who is actually the one who orchestrated his family's death and tracked him down to kill him. Then Frank shows up to help Daredevil and Elektra during their final battle against the Hand, before Elektra is actually killed during the final battle, and Matt decides to eventually gives up Daredevil for a little bit, while Frank ends up going off to complete his revenge. Meanwhile, over on Luke Cage is still trying to hide from his past and trying to hide from Reva Connors. He eventually comes into conflict with crime boss Cottonmouth before it ends up switching after Cottonmouth is killed by his sister Mariah Dillard, and Mariah comes into conflict with Luke Cage, eventually also dragging in Luke Cage's previous brother Willis Stryker, who becomes Diamondback. Eventually, Luke Cage is able to defeat them, but at the cost of being revealed as Carl Lucas, which actually sends him back to prison to finish up his sentence. This leads us into the ending of Ant-Man, where in order to complete the heist that they did back in the movie, Scott actually had to rob Avengers compound to get a device that was actually originally Hank's before it got locking in the Stark warehouse, and he ended up in a battle with Falcon. However, Falcon is now looking for Scott and is trying to find him. This then leads us to a parallel to when heading us back to Thor and Jane, where we had the parallel where Thor left Jane to go to Fury, where we have a parallel now where Jane ends up leaving Thor after getting a call about some of her science work. And then we lead into the ending of Daredevil Season 2, where we see Elektra's funeral is held, where only Stick and Matt attend, while also where Matt also ends up revealing his secret to Karen Page that he is actually Daredevil. And then we also have on the flip side, Frank ends up getting closure on his life, where he ends up destroying his family's old house. He ends up actually finding a CD labeled Micro, and he ends up going off as Punisher to finish off his revenge against the three gangs. Then we return to actually this moment. We return to to the reveal in Daredevil Season 3, where after Matt reveals to Karen that he is Daredevil, Karen ends up going on a walk trying to process that. Then we also have a thing where shortly after the funeral is held, Elektra is actually dug up by the Hand, and they use the last of the resources to resurrect her, to turn her into the Black Sky, the prophesized the great weapon that will lead the Hand to their next generation. This officially brings us into 2016, where we finally meet Stephen Strange, the world's best surgeon. And the world's best surgeon, which due to his arrogance, he ends up in a car crash that completely shatters his hands, that basically ruin his entire career. Then this brings us into the first season of Iron Fist, which after years of being in Kunlun, Danny Rand finally wants to return to New York City in his life, and he does, but it also brings him into conflict with the Hand, who is actually the sworn enemy of the Iron Fist. Danny ends up in a fight with them, ends up in a backwards fight with them, and he actually teams up with one of their best soldiers named Colleen Wang, who ends up eventually flipping sides. Danny eventually also ends up getting reinstated back into Rand Enterprises and learns through the Hand that his father's old business partner, Harold Meacham, is still alive. However, he ends up learning a dark secret that Harold Meacham actually orchestrated the Rand family plane crash, and Danny is eventually forced to kill him, which actually puts him on good terms with his son Ward Meacham, but ends up making an enemy of Danny's best friend from childhood, Joy Meacham. When Danny eventually realizes he wants to go back to Kunlun with Colleen, on the return trip, he actually finds that Kunlun was destroyed and the gateway was permanently sealed. This leads us into we end up coming back to Stephen Strange, who has been trying to recover from events of his hand shattering, but he just can't find any way to do it. That's when he ends up actually meeting a man who actually learned how to re-walk after becoming paralyzed. And from this interaction with the man, he ends up learning about the mysterious place known as Kamar-Taj. This leads us to another flashback where we see Jane and Thor starting to drift apart, where Jane ends up fully developing herself into her notes and research, leaving pretty much Thor as an afterthought almost. This leads us to the opening of The Punisher Season 1, where Frank Castle actually finishes his revenge against the three gangs, and in turn burns his Punisher vest and goes into hiding, adopting a whole new identity. This leads us into the opening of Captain America Civil War, where we see the Lagos mission, where the Avengers work together to try to stop Crossbones, aka a former agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. Rumlow, from stealing a dangerous virus, but then when he tries to use a suicide vest, Wanda actually accidentally propels him into a building that kills a bunch of Wakandans. While at the same time, Tony Stark over at MIT gives off a presentation of his new technology named Binary Auto Retroframing Technology, or BARF, which actually catches the scorn from Quentin Beck, the designer of that technology, that he ends up getting so mad at Tony that he tries to tell him off, but Tony just fires him in the end. Similarly, at the same time, after Tony ends up leaving the stage, he ends up meeting a woman who ends up telling him about Charles Spencer, someone who died during the events of the Sokovia battle in Age of Ultron, which causes Tony to have a little bit of wavering opinions on what the Avengers are doing. This actually leads us into coming up with Stephen Strange as he actually arrives in Kamar-Taj and gets takes his first journey through the multiverse, through the Ancient One, and actually eventually, after multiple hours of pleading, is eventually allowed to train at Kamar-Taj. This eventually leads us actually into the opening of the Defenders, where the Hand are now the Hand now using the Black Scarab trying to take over New York City, which leads Matt Murdock, Jessica Jones, Luke Cage, and Iron Fist all team up to go after them. And it ends up in a whole battle where they eventually are able to kill the Hand for good. But in the end, during the final battle, a building gets dropped on Daredevil. But don't worry, we find out in the opening episodes of Daredevil Season 3 that Matt actually survives this battle, but he is badly injured and is taken to the church where Father Lantham is, and his death is kept secret from everyone, while Danny actually takes up the role as the new defender of Hell's Kitchen. Then we jump to the training we jump back to Doctor Strange, where we find out that he is still in his training and he is learning about sling rings now. And he eventually, in order to help him learn how to use sling rings, the Ancient One strands him on Mount Everest, where Doctor Strange is finally able to learn how to use sling rings. Next, we finally catch back up with Elena Belova, who is still in a mission for the Red Room. The Red Room actually wasn't destroyed when Natasha blew up the building with Dreykov's daughter, and in order to prevent anyone going rogue again, Dreykov has started mind controlling the widows to make sure that he can fully control them. During a mission in Morocco, while Yelena is trying to track down a former Black Widow, they end up spraying her with this red chemical, which actually frees her from mind control, and she ends up stealing the rest of the vials to go into hiding. This actually leads us into the main events of Captain America Civil War, where the Sokovia Accords are put into place to try to prevent the Avengers from causing any more major damage. The Avengers end up having a divide on how to deal with this damage and causes a civil war between them, which eventually leads to the Avengers breaking up and in not very much of a good place. But it does lead to some things where Spider-Man is recruited as Tony's protege, Black Panther shows up as part of the team, and the team ends up having to send Bucky and the Avengers that didn't agree with the terms, like Bucky, Sam, and Natasha, into hiding, while the rest of the Avengers are kind of left broken as a whole. This leads us actually into some of the overlapping events we have from that movie, where we have the post-credit scene of Ant-Man, which is just the interrogation scene from this movie, the interrogation scene of Bucky from this movie, and also the opening video from Spider-Man: Homecoming, where Peter ends up documenting his adventure to Germany because he wanted to showcase it to the world, which then leads into the next event where Peter is actually returned home by Tony Stark, and Peter has to make up a lie to his Aunt May about why his eye is black, saying he got beat up by a guy named Steve. This leads us into the events of Black Widow, which takes place one day after the main events of Civil War, where Natasha ends up reuniting with Elena Belova and learning the Red Room is still around, and so the two of them end up reuniting with Alexei and Melina to go after the Red Room while being hunted by Taskmaster, who actually turns out a villain named Taskmaster, who turns out to be Dreykov's daughter. Eventually, Elena and Natasha are able to bring down the Red Room for good and are able to free all the widows, which, in order to give them a fighting chance, Natasha allows them all to escape Ross, while she ends up taking on him by herself. This then leads us into the events of Black Panther, which is 1 week after the events of Civil War, which after King T'Chaka was murdered in an explosion in Civil War, T'Challa takes up the mantle of king, but eventually comes into the contact of Eric Stevens, aka Killmonger, who is someone who wants the throne of Wakanda. He eventually gets the throne of Wakanda, but not before T'Challa ends up coming back to claim Wakanda. But he ends up actually adopting some of Killmonger's ideology and decides to actually open Wakanda to the rest of the world and share the vibranium resource with the world, which in turn integrates Wakanda into the world. This leads us into the ending of Black Widow, where Natasha ends up being able to get a Quinjet, which she uses to go off to reunite with Steve and Bucky to help them. Which leads into the actual ending of Captain America Civil War, where Steve ends up sending a letter to Tony Stark explaining his side of the story and giving him a flip phone, which Tony can use to call Steve anytime he needs him, while at the same time, Natasha, Bucky, and Steve break into the Raft prison to break out the other members of Team Cap from that movie. Most of them go into hiding except for Scott and Clint, who turn themselves over to the authorities because it's too hard on their families, and they end up getting put under house arrest. This leads us into the ending of Black Panther, where T'Challa officially decides to open Wakanda to the world by giving a press conference and buying the building that actually Njobu was murdered in, to turn it into a Wakandan outreach center, which will be headed by his sister Shuri. This leads us into the first time we've actually seen Thor and Jane for a little while, where we finally get the epitome of the two of them finally in kind of drifting apart as the two of them sit on opposite sides of the couch from one another. Then we end up cutting back to Civil War, where due to Bucky still not being fully aware of his Winter Soldier personality, he is actually frozen in Wakanda to keep him safe, and Steve does warn T'Challa that if the governments of the world ever find out Bucky's here, they'll come for them, but T'Challa sorely dares them to try. This leads us back into Doctor Strange, where we finally learn that Doctor Strange is actually being taught about the mirror dimension and relics. And then we finally lead into Spider-Man Homecoming, which is actually set 2 months after the events of Civil War, where Peter Parker is trying to prove himself as a hero, and the hero amongst the shadow of Tony Stark. Eventually, Peter learns about the underground black market smugglings of the Vulture, who is Adrian Toomes. Peter ends up in a fight with Vulture behind Tony's back, which causes Tony to take back Peter's high-tech suit. Peter eventually proves that he's worthy of it by actually taking down Vulture, and when Tony actually offers Peter a spot on the Avengers, Peter actually turns it down because he wants to be a small town hero for a little while longer, but Tony does give him back his high-tech suit, and Peter continues to be the friendly neighbor Spider-Man. He also ends up, Ned Leeds, his best friend, and his Aunt May also do learn his identity in this movie. Then we also finally catch back up with the Punisher, where we have the first 7 episodes of the series, where Frank actually learns from Micro, who he ends up coming into contact with in these episodes, that the Castle family murder goes a lot deeper than he initially thought. So the two of them end up teaming up together to try to take down the criminal operations of Agent Orange and Billy Russo. This leads into jumping back into Thor and Jane, where the two of them end up having an argument over dinner, which leads us into back to Daredevil, where due to Matt just staying at the church now, being healed by Father Lantham and Maggie Grace, where the orphans of the church the orphanage keep visiting Matt Murdock, which causes Father Lantham to shoo them off. Then we jump into the last episodes of Punisher Season 1, where Frank Castle finally learns that Billy Russo is the one who orchestrated his family's death, and the two of them end up in a battle at the carousel where it all happened, where Frank Castle actually smashes Billy Russo into a mirror, which gives him cranial trauma, and Frank Castle gets a pardon because of helping the government take down Billy Russo, and he gets to go into hiding once again. This leads us back to Wakanda, where we find out that Bucky has actually been unfrozen, and his recovery is being overwatched by Shuri. Then we jump into 2017, where first event we have is Madani, one of the Homeland Security agents who helped Punisher, is actually interviewed by her superiors about the events of Punisher Season 1, but she keeps a lot of the events really vague in order not to get herself in trouble. Then we jump finally into the main events of Doctor Strange, which is basically everything as Caecilius finally is able to decipher the codes from the Book of Cagliostro and is able to contact Dormammu, who he steals power from to start using to destroy the 3 sanctums around Earth that'll allow Dormammu to actually invade the planet. During the efforts of Doctor Strange to try to stop them, the Ancient One is actually killed, and Doctor Strange is named the new Sorcerer Supreme. Doctor Strange also learns about the Eye of Agamotto, a ancient relic that actually contains the Time Infinity Stone. He ends up using that thing in the final battle against Caecilius to undo the damage of the last sanctum, but then he ends up going into the Dark Dimension to confront Dormammu. He ends up placing both of them in a time loop where Doctor Strange is eventually able to bargain with Dormammu to take Caecilius from the Earth, take Caecilius himself from the Earth to never come back, or else Doctor Strange will put him back into the loop. This eventually comes into the end where Doctor Strange becomes the Sorcerer Supreme, but one of his mentors, Mordo, decides to actually leave Kamar-Taj because of the fact that he feels betrayed by the Ancient One using the power of the Dark Dimension, which he strictly told none of them to ever do. This leads us into finally, after months of arguing and all that, Thor and Jane finally break up, with Jane actually just writing a letter to Thor and then leaving, which Thor eventually finds. This leads us back into the events of Daredevil, where we see Karen and Foggy end up meeting up at Matt's apartment, where Karen actually begs Foggy to help her keep paying Matt's payments because she has a feeling that Matt is not actually dead. This leads us into the main events of Jessica Jones Season 2, where after months of Jessica running her agency and still being hesitant on the whole superhero thing, she ends up learning that her mother is still alive, and the two of them come into contact with one another as Jessica tries to keep her mother safe before she ends up causing any outrages. However, Trish, as still wanting that superhero life that she's so desired, ends up getting some superpowers this season from experiments on IGH, and actually due to a misunderstanding, she ends up killing Alyssa, which ends up permanently destroying Jessica and Trish's relationship. And it ends up with also Malcolm quitting Alias Investigations to go work for Jerry Hogarth, a lawyer who kind of comes in odds with Jessica Jones this season. This leads us into the opening of some of the flashbacks from Jessica Jones season 3, where due to Trish tries to come to apologize to Jessica. Jessica doesn't want to hear it. But while Trish is actually leaving the apartment, she actually ends up catching her phone on her foot, which proves that her superpowers are still around, even though her IGH experiments apparently weren't super successful. This leads into an extensive training montage where Trish ends up training with a personal trainer to try to get super fit to try to be a superhero. This then also we catch back up with Billy Russo, who is still in recovery after the events of Punisher season 1, where he now wears a mask, and he can't really remember too much, but he does know that there's a man with a skull on his chest that actually caused his pain. This then we also catch up with Mordo, who actually swears revenge on all sorcerers, actually stealing the magic from the man who actually told Strange about Carmitage earlier. Then we come into the main events of Luke Cage season 2, where Luke Cage comes up as this huge crime fighter in Harlem, and comes back into the hindsight of Mariah Dillard. However, he also comes into contact with Bushmaster, who comes actually to haunt Mariah Dillard to take down the Stokes crime empire. Eventually, they all end up in one giant fight that ends up with Mariah Dillard dying, and she actually gives up Harlem's Paradise to Luke Cage, and Luke Cage becomes the new crime boss of Harlem. This then leads us back to Daredevil, where actually after the orphans keep visiting and bothering Matt, Father Lantham finally makes up the argument to move Matt down to the basement of the church, where Matt finally begins retraining to try to regain some of his senses that were sort of lost during the Midland Circle battle. Then we jump into the first 4 episodes of Iron Fist season 2, where Danny Rand, still trying to keep up his promise to Matt to be the defender of New York, of Hell's Kitchen. He ends up in struggles when Davos returns to New York City, and working with Joy Meacham tries to performs a ritual on Danny that actually steals his Iron Fist and gives it to Davos, which Davos uses to incite a full-on Civil War conflict within Hell's Kitchen. Then we have a quick break where we go back to Daredevil, where we see that Father Lantham actually and Maggie Grace visit Matt in the basement to see him training, and it's a very simple flashback. Then we come to episodes 5 through 7 of Iron Fist season 2, where we end up having Danny continuing to try to get his Iron Fist back, but ends up in a really bad surgery about midway through episode 7, which is where we end up. Then we come to an event where Trish Walker actually ends up meeting up with her mother, who is angry that Trish hasn't taken up a proper job in a couple months. But Trish tells her that she's working on something. Shortly after, Trish actually prevents a robbery, but she ends up accidentally hurting the guy who is being robbed, and the guy ends up very angry at Trish Walker because he recognizes her. This brings us into the overlapping events of Daredevil Season 3 and also Iron Fist Season 2, where we have Iron Fist Episode 7, Daredevil Episodes 1 through 4, Iron Fist Episode 8, Daredevil Episode 5, Iron Fist Episode 9 through 10, Daredevil Episode 6 through 7. In the back half of Iron Fist Season 2, Danny Rand is eventually finally able to perform the ritual on Davos. However, he doesn't actually give the Iron Fist back to himself. He actually gives it to Colleen, who he believes is more worthy of it. And actually at the end, Danny, still having some conflicting thoughts about the Iron Fist in general, actually leaves New York City with Ward Meacham to try to learn more about the Iron Fist history over in a different country. Meanwhile, over on Daredevil, we actually learned that Kingpin has actually gotten out of prison on a deal with the government, and to live in his penthouse again and get all his stuff back, while also handing over the names of different crime people within New York City. However, this becomes a whole ruse as he ends up just putting all the police back into his pocket and just running New York City once again as a crime boss, just eliminating all the competition. And to make matters worse, shortly into this first season, he also learns that Matt Murdock is Daredevil, so that he ends up in contact. But he does also hire a man named Ben Poindexter, an FBI agent with incredible accuracy, who ends up impersonating Daredevil to ruin his reputation. This actually cuts us back over to Jessica Jones real quick, where we end up seeing Trish after her face was recognized by her robber a little while ago. She ends up trying to find a superhero outfit she can wear, which she doesn't really settle on a good outfit, except she does find a good one, which is a bandana, a beanie, and a simple jacket. Eventually choosing her superhero name, Hellcat. This leads us into the back half of Daredevil Season 3, where Matt Murdock eventually comes into final confrontation with the Kingpin, and is eventually able to make a deal with Kingpin that he will never come after Foggy or Karen or him ever again, or he will harm Vanessa. A deal Daredevil eventually takes. However, also during this, Dex also had his back broken, and his spine is replaced with a vibranium spine, saving his life. This brings us into a reconnect with Trish Walker, which the guy that she actually saved who recognized her actually gives her a subpoena, which Trish doesn't fully know how to recognize as she hasn't had a job in a while and doesn't have the money to pay for it. This leads us into the events of Thor Ragnarok, where Thor finally learns that Loki actually took over Odin's spot, and the two of them head to Earth to go find Odin. When Odin finally reveals he is dying, and when he does die, Hela is finally able to return to the Earth, and she actually goes to Asgard to take over it, stranding Loki and Thor on Sakaar, where they end up finding the last remaining Valkyrie warrior, and also Hulk. Eventually, they all end up being able to make it back to Asgard, where they fight off Hela, but they find out the only way to prevent Hela from getting any more powerful is to Ragnarok the planet, which they do before getting all of Asgard's people off in a ship known as the Statesman. Afterwards, the Asgardians decide to head towards Earth, as Asgard is no more, as the place is no more, but Asgard still lives on in the form of its people. This finally brings us into 2018, where we have the first event is during the events of while Bucky is in Wakanda. He is actually one of his Dora Milaje friends is actually Ao, who actually recites the Winter Soldier activation phrase to Bucky. But when Bucky doesn't turn, he feels so happy that he is finally free of his Winter Soldier programming. This leads us into checking back in with Jessica Jones real quick, where we find out that she actually goes to Malcolm and actually asks for his help to get the subpoena repealed, which he is able to do for her. Then we jump into a little bit of a fun one where Wade Wilson, or Deadpool from an alternate timeline, actually uses a time machine to time travel to the sacred timeline, where he ends up having an interview with Happy Hogan to audition to be an Avenger, but Happy ends up turning Wade down, and Wade ends up returning back to his home universe shortly after. Then we jump to a thing where Trish is actually trying to pick up a job to appease her mother, ends up taking up a new show where she sells sweaters in a show called Style by Trish. Then we jump into actually the ending of Iron Fist Season 2 officially, where we find out that Colleen has been taking up the protection of New York City, where she actually has found out how to transfer the Iron Fist into her katana to make her a really powerful hero, while at the same time, Iron Fist, Danny Rand, and Ward Meacham are actually in Hokkaido, where they actually are trying to track down secrets about the Iron Fist, and they actually reveal that Danny has somehow regained the Iron Fist abilities that he now can transition into two pistols. Then we jump into the prelude to our Punisher Season 2, where Pilgrim is actually hired to track down a girl who stole secrets from this rich family, and Pilgrim agrees to do it because the rich family also takes his kids as collateral. This leads us into the overlapping events of Punisher Season 2 and Jessica Jones Season 3, where we have Punisher Season 1, Jessica Jones Season 1, which overlaps with the Episode 2 flashback at Brand's apartment, and Episode 4's flashback of Eric's story. Then we have Punisher Episode 2, Jessica Jones Episode 2, Punisher Season 3, Episode 3, Jessica Jones Episode 3, and Punisher Episode 4. The first half of Jessica Jones is Jessica starts investigating some mysterious criminal activity around the city, and ends up coming into contact with a serial killer known as Gregory Salinger. While on the flip side, Punisher ends up meeting a mysterious girl named Amy, who is being hunted by Pilgrim. Before Punisher is actually brought back to New York by Madani, because Billy Russo has escaped custody at the hospital, and now Punisher needs to hunt him down again. Then we have a quick break where we can talk about Ant-Man and the Wasp, where after 2 years on house arrest, Scott Lang is almost free, where Scott Lang has 2 days left, but then he learns that Hank and Hope are trying to find Janet in the quantum realm, and that they believe Scott has some kind of antenna in his head has a message from Janet that reveals her location. The two of them end up working together as both Ant-Man and the Wasp, trying to evade Ghost, who wants to steal the quantum tunnel, to help herself, but it would actually kill Janet. Eventually, they are able to get Janet out of the quantum realm, and Scott is able to return home just in time to be able to get off of house arrest. This then allows us to come back to Punisher and Jessica Jones, where we have Punisher Episode 5, Jessica Jones Episode 4, Punisher Episode 6, Jessica Jones Episode 5 and 6, Punisher Episode 7, Jessica Jones Episode 7, Punisher Episode 8, Jessica Jones Episode 8, which overlaps with the Episode 11 Salinger attack flashback, Punisher Episode 9, Jessica Jones Episode 9, which overlaps with the Episode 11 cleaning flashback, the Punisher Episode 10 through 12, Jessica Jones Episode 10, which overlaps with the Episode 11 coffin flashback, the Punisher Episode 13, and Jessica Jones Episode 11 and 12, which basically overlaps with Punisher's entire back half, deals with him eventually being able to track down Billy Russo and actually killing him, and eventually is also able to help Pilgrim by getting his children back for him by killing the rich couple that ended up taking them, while at the same time Jessica Jones eventually reunites with Trish Walker, now going by Hellcat, and the two of them work together to try to take down Gregory Salinger, before Gregory Salinger actually goes too far by killing Trish's mom, which causes Trish to go spiraling, and eventually she kills Salinger, which forces actually Jessica to bring Trish in, and Trish is actually sentenced to go to the Raft prison. Then we actually recheck back in with the Guardians really quick, as we see that Groot has now grown up into a teenager, and he is basically inhibiting all the teenage stereotypes that actually really annoy Star-Lord. Then now we have the final episode of Jessica Jones, in which Jessica is forced to go after Trish Walker. She brings her in, and Trish is actually sent to go to the Raft prison. Then we actually have the post-credit scene of Thor Ragnarok, in which the Statesman ship is actually attacked by Thanos' ship, because that leads straight into Avengers Infinity War, where Thanos finally comes out of hiding to collect the Infinity Stones and comes into conflict with the Avengers, with multiple of them dying, including Loki, Heimdall, Gamora, and Vision, with the ending of the film actually causes Thanos to actually snap his fingers, which causes half of all life in the universe to turn to dust. Then we have a couple of overlapping events, as we have a couple of the characters we know disappear. As we see in Hawkeye episode 5, Yelena disappears. During the ending of Ant-Man and the Wasp, Scott actually goes down into the quantum realm to get some healing particles for Ghost, but before he can get pulled back up, Hank, Hope, and Janet dust. Then we also have, during a drive in New York, Nick Fury and Maria Hill actually dust too, but not before Nick Fury is actually able to call Carol Danvers on his pager. And then we also, on the Barton farm, Clint Barton is shocked as his entire family turns to dust behind his back. Then at the same time, we also see a video inspired from Far From Home, which shows multiple Midtown High students disappearing during a pep rally with the marching band. Then this leads to the other post-credit scene of Ant-Man and the Wasp, in which Scott Lang's house is left empty, and the giant ant from this movie just plays the drum to lead the film on a comedic note. This leads us to the post-credit scene of Captain Marvel, in which, due to Fury's pager, Carol Danvers actually arrives on Earth and comes into contact with the Avengers before asking where Fury is. This leads us into the opening scene of Avengers Endgame, where Tony Stark and Nebula are actually returned to Earth after being stranded in space, before the Avengers are able to finally find Thanos. When they find him, they discover that he actually destroyed the Infinity Stones, so that there's no way to undo the snap. Thor ends up chopping off his head, and all the Avengers end up going home. This leads us into the ending of The Punisher Season 2, in which after a couple months after the events of the last season, Punisher identifies his next target to go off on a killing spree, which does mean he did not dust, which is pretty interesting to think about. This leads us jumping into 2020, where we have Maria Rambeau, Carol Danvers' best friend. Actually, her cancer ends up coming back, and she ends up making a plea to Carol to take Goose and protect her legacy. Carol says that Monica will do it when she comes back, but Maria is not sure Monica will come back, because Monica was one of the ones who dusted. This is actually the last time we know that Carol will ever see Maria. This leads us into our first Ironheart flashback, where we actually have due to Chicago gang violence, the auto repair shop is attacked, which ends up actually killing Riri Williams' stepfather Gary and her best friend Natalie. And this actually is what leads Riri to actually start building an Iron Man suit, because she felt hopeless in this moment and wanted to help others. This then also leads us in the same year to Parker Robbins, who is cheated out of his family, ends up making a deal with the devil Mephisto to get his mysterious hood in order to form a team to go after his family and take over. Then we jump forward to 2021, where Maya Lopez has now started working for the Tracksuit Mafia with her father. However, one day when she returns back to the warehouse at late night, her father is actually killed alongside multiple other Tracksuit Mafia members by a mysterious vigilante known as Ronin, which is what Clint Barton is doing during the blip, because of the fact that he's angry that his family disappeared. Then this leads to a couple months later, when after Echo is almost arrested by the cops, she gets bailed out by Kingpin, who recruits her to start working for him. Then this leads into 2022, where during an expedition to Egypt, Mark Spector is actually shot and is about to die before he is found by the god of the night sky, Khonshu, who Mark Spector agrees to become the avatar for, and he becomes Moon Knight. Then we also have TVA. This is also our first reference back to the TVA, where we have Mobius and Sylvie actually arrive on the sacred timeline to see what Mobius's life would have been like as Dawn if he didn't become a TVA agent. Then we jump finally to 2023, where we come to Avengers Endgame, where the remaining Avengers come back together to undo Thanos' snap by performing the time heist that takes them to the past of the MCU to recover the Infinity Stones. They bring them to the present, where Hulk snaps and is able to revert all of the MCU characters back into existence. There's a final battle against a previous iteration of Thanos from 2014, which eventually results in Tony Stark using the 6 Infinity Stones to snap, killing Thanos but killing himself, which leads to a funeral for him. And then at the same time, Steve Rogers goes back in time to return the Infinity Stones to where they got them, but he actually decides to stay back in time to be with Peggy Carter before returning to the present as an old man to actually pass on the Captain America mantle to Sam Wilson, leading to an ending to the Infinity Saga. But not before we have a couple more overlapping events of people actually returning from the blip, where we see Yelena return in Hawkeye Season 1, Episode 5, Monica returns in WandaVision Episode 4, and we also see the Midtown High students return during a basketball game. And that brings us to the end of the Infinity Saga. You guys can probably see now why we needed a full episode just for this era of the MCU, because it is a long one. This is probably going to be the longest video in the series. But I want to thank you guys all very much for making through it. And now that we have finished we finished talking about the main events of the Sacred, we finished making through the Infinity Saga on the Sacred Timeline. I encourage you to join me next week, as next week we venture out into part 3, which will be the multiverse.